A werewolf shifter romance story, written by YKV. Prologue. They say when a wolf is beautiful enough, the altar does the rest, and perhaps for most of them, that is true. The wax pooling warm on stone, the promise golden as summer, but not for Isolde. For Isolde, this is altar number 4, and no one has crossed the room. Her gown was chosen not for her, but for what it displays, the throat, the ribs, the collarbone that 3 alphas described in writing. And every one of them declined. She keeps her spine straight. Her father taught her that much. You are worth what you display. And she was given cheekbones and silence. So she stands, while a steward descends without looking at her and announces,
"His Majesty has declined."
And 300 wolves witness her body counted and found wanting. Again. There had been a moment once. Just one. Where the air between them thickened into something almost alive. But he turned away, and that was that. She presses her hands flat against her thighs, because they are the only part no one has ever watched. She has made her peace with fine. But fate has a way of proving us wrong. Because even now, as the torchlight dims and the corridors grow cold, something stirs in the ancient stone. Something that hums beneath the walls. Something that has always been waiting for her. Something that knows her, not by her throat, but by the gift she has spent her whole life hiding. Its warmth, golden and alive and tight as wire against her teeth, already finding her. Already locking on. And Isolde will learn that being unseen was nothing compared to the devastating, all-consuming weight of being known completely, of being claimed and unraveled and chosen, not for the body they bartered, but for the hand she kept hidden. But right now, she does not know any of this. Right now, she is just a girl at an altar, hands pressed against her thighs. Chapter 1. The great hall of Veilcrest smelled of iron sconces and the collective breath of 300 wolves. The throne at the far end was empty. Isolde stood at the lunar altar in the ivory bonding gown her pack elders had selected, not for how it moved with her body, but for how it displayed what the Ashimir Council called her primary diplomatic asset. Her ribs. Her throat. The long unbroken line from collarbone to jaw that 3 separate alphas had already declined to claim. This was her 4th altar. The candles guttered. Wax pooled and hardened on the stone dais. Somewhere in the gallery a child coughed and was hushed. She counted the seconds the way she had learned to count them, by the distance between hope and its absence. 100. 200. At 600, the whispers started. Another body for the dead queen's throne. Even this one wasn't enough. She kept her spine straight. Her father had taught her that much. You are worth what you display, and you display what you're given. She had been given cheekbones and silence. So she stood. Perfectly still. Perfectly shaped. Perfectly worthless. At 40 minutes the king's steward descended the dais. He did not look at her. His Majesty has declined the ceremony. He will assess the arrangement at his convenience. The words reached her through the sound of her own pulse. Not the humiliation, that was familiar. The frequency of it. Public. Final. 300 witnesses to her body being counted and found wanting. She had been told this time would be different. She was always told this time would be different. A hand on her elbow. A guard. If the lady will follow me to the guest wing. Not the queen's quarters. The guest wing. Her bonding gown still laced. Her title already hollow. She followed the guard through the corridor without looking back. Her shoes echoed on stone that had been walked by queens. The walls hummed faintly against her skin, warm, then cold, then warm again, and she pressed her hands flat against her thighs to keep from reaching out. She had learned long ago not to acknowledge what the walls told her. From behind the gallery's farthest column, the old healer watched the Ashimir girl pass. His hands gripped stone. His knuckles whitened. The bond threads in the mortar had shifted gold. For the first time in 3 years, the walls were singing. The last time the stone had sung like that, his goddaughter was still alive. His hand found the iron key at his belt. He has made this decision before. Chapter 2. The door to her chamber closed with the sound of a decision someone else had made. Isolde stood alone in the guest room and listened to the guard's footsteps dissolve into stone. Then silence, the particular silence of a castle that had noticed a stranger in its walls and was deciding what to make of her. She unlaced the bonding gown alone. Her fingers found each hook and eye with the precision of a woman who had been dressed and undressed for other people's purposes since she was 15. The ivory silk pooled at her feet. She did not look in the mirror. She already knew what it showed. The body that was supposed to be enough. The throat that was supposed to make a king cross a room. The collarbone that 3 pack diplomats had described in writing to 3 separate courts. None of them had crossed the room either. She pulled a wool shift from her travel trunk, and the castle pressed in, not sound, not silence, but the hum she had felt in every building she had ever entered. The awareness that lived beneath her skin. Bonds between mates felt warm to her. Bonds between parent and child felt bright. Broken bonds felt like standing near an open window in winter. This castle felt wrong. Not broken. Not cold. Something off-key, as if the bonds in these walls had been built rather than grown, constructed by hands that knew the shape of connection but not its root. She couldn't sleep. At some hour past midnight she walked the corridors barefoot, her hands at her sides, her awareness open. The hum changed as she moved, warmer near the great hall where pack bonds clustered, colder as she drifted east. The east corridor stopped her dead. The walls here did not hum. They screamed, a single high frequency, tight as wire, that vibrated in her teeth and pressed behind her eyes. She flattened her palm against the stone. Cold. Sharp. A clean edge. Not a bond that had broken. A bond that had been cut. Behind her, a footstep. She turned. The corridor was dark, but the figure at its far end blocked the archway entirely. The King of Veilcrest stood in his own castle at some nameless hour of the night, and he was looking at her the way a man looks at a wound he did not know he carried. Neither of them spoke. The air between them thickened, not metaphor, not imagination, but a pressure change against her skin, as if the space between their bodies had become a living thing. He took one step forward. She took one step back. Her bare shoulder blades hit the stone wall of the east corridor, and the contact between her skin and the castle sent a shock through her body so sudden her breath locked in her chest. Not pain. Something before pain. Something that had a name she did not know. When she opened her eyes, the corridor was empty. He was gone. The nearest candle had snuffed itself out. And the walls that had screamed through the entire length of the east corridor, had gone silent. The stone beneath her shoulder blades is warm. Chapter 3. The warmth hadn't faded by morning. Isolde sat on the edge of the guest bed with her palm pressed to the wall and tried to convince herself that stone held heat for 8 hours. It didn't. She knew it didn't. The warmth was not in the wall. It was in whatever the wall remembered. She dressed in the plainest thing she owned, a gray wool dress that covered her throat and wrists and turned her body into a shape no one would describe in a letter to anyone. It felt like armor. The steward appeared before the second bell. The council will see you. His Majesty will be present. She followed him through corridors that hummed beneath her feet, pack bonds running through the mortar like veins, warm where families clustered, cooler near the barracks. In the east corridor, the same thin screaming frequency she could feel in her teeth. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs and walked past it. The council chamber, long oak table, iron candelabra, 7 elders in high-backed chairs. The king stood at the head. Not seated. As if sitting would mean this meeting mattered. She saw him in daylight for the first time. He was built the way the castle was built, for authority, not comfort. Dark hair. A jaw that could have been carved from the same stone as his walls. His shirt was open at the collar, the hollow at the base of his throat exposed, the place where Aluna's mark would sit, and even that small vulnerability looked deliberate, as if he dared anyone to try. His eyes were the color of winter light through ice. They did not look at her. Past her. As if looking directly cost him something he was not willing to spend. The sovereign mandate, the steward announced, Requires a formal assessment period of 30 days before the king's refusal is recognized by allied pacts. The Ashenmere candidate will remain at Valecrest for the duration. Candidate. Not bride. Not even guest. She reached for the water vessel on the table. His hand was already on the handle. Their fingers met on the iron. The shock traveled through her palm, up the inside of her wrist, and landed behind her sternum like a fist closing around a lit coal. Not pain. Something before pain. Something with a name she had never learned. She pulled back. He didn't flinch. His expression didn't change. But beneath the table, she saw it, his hand closed into a fist and held. "The guest wing will suffice," he said. "For the duration." She nodded. Her fingers tingled. She pressed them into her thigh and told herself, static. Dry air. Iron handles. Old stone. Her lay sight disagreed. The bonds in this room ran from each elder to the king like taut wire, duty, obligation, constructed loyalty. Nothing organic. Nothing that had grown from love. All except one. The oldest elder sat 3 seats to the king's left. White-haired. A healer's hands, she recognized the calluses. Kind face. Patient mouth. And his bond thread did not run to the king at all. It ran behind the king. To something absent. Something that used to be in this room and was not anymore. Grief so deep it read like devotion. A thread tied to something dead. Isolde looked at the old healer. He was already looking at her. And behind the kindness in his eyes, behind the patience, behind the years, she sees a question he is terrified she can answer. Chapter 4. The question in the old healer's eyes stayed with her long after the council chamber emptied. Night fell differently in Valecrest. In Ashenmere, darkness arrived gradually, the forest canopy softening twilight into dusk. Here, the stone swallowed light whole. One moment the corridors were amber with torch glow. The next, shadow claimed everything below the sconce line, and the castle became a place made entirely of sound. Isolde couldn't sleep. She had not slept a full night since arriving. The castle's hum was constant, not loud but present, the way a heartbeat is present, ignorable until you listen for it, and then impossible to unhear. At 2 in the morning she gave up and went to find the one room in Valecrest that didn't ask anything of her. The kitchen was warm. Banked fires. Flour dust suspended in air that smelled of ash and rosemary, and the iron hooks hanging from the ceiling like a percussion section waiting to be struck. She baked. Not because anyone asked. Not because it was expected. In Ashenmere, when the council was done deciding what to do with her face for the day, she would walk to the kitchens because the cooks didn't care what she looked like. They cared whether the bread rose. It was the one competence no one could barter. The night patrol guards found her an hour later, 2 young wolves barely older than pups, frost on their collars, exhaustion carved into their faces. They stopped in the doorway and stared at the fresh bread cooling on the stone counter as if they had hallucinated it.
"Eat," she said.
They ate. They didn't ask her name, her rank, or why she was awake. They thanked her with full mouths and went back into the cold. She was kneading a second batch when she felt him. Not heard. Felt. The bond threads in the kitchen walls shifted. The ambient hum of a sleeping castle pulled toward the doorway like iron filings drawn to a magnet. The air thickened. Her skin prickled, and beneath the flour and the ash and the banked fire she caught a scent that did not belong to the kitchen. Pine. Iron. And beneath that, something animal, something warm-blooded and enormous, something that made the fine hair on her forearms stand and her breath catch against her will. Not fear. Recognition. Her body knew something her mind refused to name. "You're in my kitchen." She turned. The king of Valecrest stood in the doorway in a linen shirt, no crown, no court, no 7 elders between them. He looked less. Not diminished. Unperformed. A man before he remembered he was king. "Technically," she said, "it's the night patrol's kitchen. I'm borrowing it." He didn't smile. But something behind his eyes shifted, the way a locked door shifts when the right key is tested but not yet turned. He entered, took a piece of bread from the counter, ate it standing, one shoulder against the stone wall, watching her hands work the dough with the quiet attention of someone cataloging evidence he hadn't planned to collect. A full minute passed. Neither spoke. Who taught you? Not why are you here? Not what are you doing in the servants' wing at 3 in the morning? Not a single question about what she looked like. Who taught you? No one, she said. And because it was 3 in the morning and the dark had made her honest.
In Ashenmere, when they were done deciding what to do with me for the day, I went to the kitchens. The cooks didn't care about my face.
They cared whether the bread rose. He took a second piece. She watched him eat it, the king of Valecrest, barefoot on a kitchen floor, chewing bread a wolfless candidate had made because she couldn't sleep and the guards hadn't eaten. The absurdity of it should have diminished him. It didn't. It made him reel. As he reached the doorway, he stopped without turning. Tell the steward the kitchen is yours. Whatever hour. Thank you, Less disruption than finding you in the corridors. He was gone. The warmth he'd left behind should have dissipated with the closing door. It didn't. The bond threads in the kitchen walls hummed at a frequency they had not hummed at before he entered. Lower, steadier, as if the castle itself was remembering something it had been told to forget. Then, a small sound from the same doorway. Not the king. A child. 4 maybe. Dark eyes too large for her face. A wool blanket dragging behind her like a bridal train. She stood exactly where the king had stood, drawn by bread and warmth and the particular gravity of a room with someone in it who was still awake. Isolde held out a piece of bread. The child took it. Sat on the floor beside the hearth. Ate with the focused silence of someone who had learned that meals were not always guaranteed. What's your name? Ren. Are you supposed to be in bed, Ren? The child considered this with devastating seriousness. Are you? Something cracked in Isolde's chest. Not pain. Something warmer than pain. She sat on the stone floor beside the child and said nothing, and the bread was warm between them, and for the first time since she arrived in Valecrest, the hum in the walls sounded almost like a lullaby. In the east wing, Elder Coram unsealed the bottom drawer of his apothecary chest. 3 glass vials. Blackthorn extract. The same compound. The same dosage. He counted them twice. Then he took parchment and began a letter to the Ashenmere Pack Council, requesting the immediate return of their daughter on grounds of medical unsuitability for the assessment period. Every word was reasonable. Every word was a lie. The ink dries on a letter that could save 2 lives, or end one. Chapter 5. There were lies in the stone of Valecrest, and they had been there for 3 years. Isolde could hear them now. Not words. The lay sight didn't work in language. But pressure. Dissonance. The feeling you get when someone is smiling with their mouth but not their eyes, translated into the hum of ancient mortar and bond threads woven through granite. She hadn't meant to go back to the east corridor. But the pressure behind her eyes eased only when she faced the direction it was pulling, and it pulled east with an insistence that felt less like curiosity and more like grief, as if the walls themselves needed someone to listen. The corridor was empty at midday. Torches unlit. Flagstones filmed with 3 years of dust. No one came here. No one tended this passage. Whatever lived at the end of it had been sealed away and forgotten by everyone who had the authority to remember. Everyone except the walls. She stopped before the iron-studded oak door. It was older than the castle around it. The iron was black with tarnish. The oak scarred where something had singed the grain, not burned, but touched by heat intense enough to leave a memory in the wood. She pressed her palm flat against the door. The lay sight opened. Not sickness. That was the first thing she knew, and she knew it the way she knew her own name, with a certainty that lived beneath thought. She had felt bond sickness before. The widows of Ashenmere carried it like watermarks in stone, slow fading, the quiet dissolution of something that had been real and simply couldn't survive alone. Bond sickness was grief made structural. This was not grief. This was a cut. Clean. Precise. The work of someone who understood the bond's architecture so completely they could find the single thread holding it together and sever it without disturbing anything on either side. Not violence. Not accident. Knowledge so intimate it could only belong to someone who had loved the bond's owner. She pulled her hand back. Her fingers trembled. "You shouldn't be here." His voice came from behind her, close. Closer than the corridor's width required. She hadn't heard him approach, but the castle's hum had swallowed everything except the door. She turned. Caius stood 3 paces behind her. Arms crossed. His collar was open, that unguarded hollow at the base of his throat, pale against the dark fabric, the place where a Luna's claiming mark would sit if he had one. If he still had one. His jaw was set, his posture a wall, but his eyes were on the door, not on her. And in them, she saw it clearly, the most powerful Lycan in 5 kingdoms was afraid of a wooden door. "Your Majesty." "Caius." "What?" "My name." He said it the way he said everything, short, declarative, offering nothing beyond the word itself. "If you are going to wander my castle at all hours, use my name." The air between them compressed, the same pressure she had felt in the corridor that first night, the same thickening, as if proximity was a physical substance and they were generating more of it than the space could hold. She should have left. She said the things she shouldn't have. What happened in this room? His eyes moved from the door to her. She felt the shift like a change in temperature. The council sealed this chamber after Ilara's death. His voice was steady. A king's voice, giving a king's answer. Bond sickness leaves a residue in the stone. No one enters. Bond sickness. Yes. He believed it. She could feel the truth of his conviction running through his bond threads, steady, unshakable, the foundation on which 3 years of grief and governance had been built. He believed his Luna had died of sickness. He believed the council sealed the room to protect the castle. He believed every word. And every word was wrong. What lived in those walls was not the slow dissolution of sickness. It was a blade. And the hand that held it had known exactly where to cut. His hand closed around her wrist. Not rough. Not gentle. A boundary. "Don't come back to this corridor, Isolde." He used her name. Not the Ashenmere girl. Not the candidate. Her name, and it sounded in his low voice, like a door being held shut against something that wanted very badly to open. She left. He did not follow. But as she reached the end of the corridor and the torchlight from the main hall broke across her face, she understood 2 things she had not understood before. The first, someone in this castle had killed the Luna's bond with a healer's precision and a lover's knowledge. The second, the bond she expected to find beneath the severance, the great broken remnant of a fated love between king and queen, was not what lived in that stone. What she had felt instead was something built. Assembled. A bond constructed with extraordinary skill, designed to look and feel and function like a fated connection. But underneath the architecture, underneath the craft, there was no foundation at all. She walks back toward the light with a question she is not yet brave enough to ask aloud. If the king's bond with his Luna was never what he believed it was, then what is the thing that pulls the air tight every time he stands too close to her? Chapter 6. The pull did not ease with distance. Isolde spent the morning in her guest chamber with the shutters closed, tracing the ley lines in the walls with her fingertips and telling herself she was studying the castle's bond architecture, not tracking where he moved through it. She could feel him, 3 floors below, crossing the great hall. Each step displaced the hum in the stone the way a dropped rock displaces still water. She pressed her palms flat and pulled them away. She was not going to become a woman who mapped a man through walls. A knock. The old healer stood in her doorway with a clay cup and a smile built for grandchildren. Sleep tonic. Ashwood and valerian. He held it out. Steady hands. A healer's hands. Careful, practiced, kind. The castle can be difficult for new arrivals. She took the cup. Smelled it. Ashwood and valerian, as promised. Beneath that, something faintly bitter she could not name. "Thank you, elder." Quorum. The same correction the king had made. His name, offered like a key. "You remind me of someone, child." "The first, Luna." The warmth in his face did not shift, but the bond thread behind it flinched, a spasm of grief so sharp she felt it in her own chest. "You have her bearing," he said carefully. "Rest well." She set the cup on the windowsill and did not drink it. Night came. The kitchen came. The flour and the fire and the quiet mechanics of something her hands could do while her mind turned. Ren came. The child appeared at the same hour. Dark eyes, dragging blanket, the focused solemnity of someone who had learned to be invisible and hadn't yet decided whether that was a choice or a sentence. Bread. Isolde tore a piece. Ren sat on the hearthstone and ate, and for 10 minutes there was nothing in the world except warmth and the sound of a child chewing. Then the hum shifted. She felt him before she heard him, the bond threads pulling taut, the temperature climbing 1/2 degree, the involuntary tightening at the base of her throat where her pulse had apparently decided to live whenever the King of Veilcrest was within 20 feet of her. He appeared in the doorway. Saw Ren. Stopped. "She's not supposed to be here," Isolde said. She didn't know why it came out like an apology. "Neither am I." Not a joke. A fact he hadn't decided what to do with. Ren looked up. Her face held no deference, no fear, no awareness that she was sitting in bread crumbs at the feet of the most powerful Lycan in 5 kingdoms. She held up the remains of her peace. "Want some?" He crossed the kitchen, took the bread, sat on the hearthstone beside the child. Isolde stood at the work table with flour on her wrists and watched something happen that she was not supposed to see. Ren leaned. Not dramatically, the small, unconscious gravity of a child whose body makes decisions before her mind can intervene. She leaned into the king's side, and after a pause so weighted Isolde could feel it press against the ley lines in the walls, he shifted his arm and let her settle. He did not look at Isolde. He looked at the fire. His hand rested on the child's back, too large, too careful, as if he was aware of every ounce of force his body could produce and was holding all of it in check for something that weighed less than a sack of flour. Ren's eyes closed. The king did not move. Minutes passed. The fire spoke. The bread cooled. The man who had declined a Luna at the altar held a parentless child against his ribs and let her sleep, and Isolde watched him do it from across a room that had become so full of something unspoken the ley threads in the walls were humming low and warm. His breathing changed. Slower. His jaw unclenched by degrees. She watched the tension leave his shoulders the way snow leaves a branch, not all at once, but in a slow, silent surrender to a weight it could no longer hold. He was beautiful. Not the way the court described him. Powerful, commanding, a king worth fearing. Beautiful the way a fire is beautiful when you have been cold for a long time and someone has finally opened the door. She turned back to the dough. Her hands shook. She pressed them flat and kneaded until they stopped. When she looked again, Ren was fully asleep. Caius lifted the child, one arm beneath her knees, one behind her back, the blanket trailing, and carried her toward the doorway. He paused beside Isolde. Close enough that his scent pine, iron, the animal warmth beneath, washed over her like a tide she hadn't braced against. Close enough that if she turned her head, she would be looking at the unmarked hollow of his throat. She didn't turn her head. "She wanders at night," he said, his voice low enough that it lived in the space between his chest and hers. "She's afraid of the dark. So she comes to the kitchen. She comes to wherever someone is awake." He looked at her then. Not past her. Not through her. At her. The first time she had felt his full attention without the barrier of the court between them, and it landed on her skin like a handprint, warm, specific, impossible to misread. His mouth opened. A door slammed, the servant's entrance, and 2 cooks stumbled in for the dawn shift, laughing, stamping cold from their boots. Caius stepped back. His expression sealed. The king returned like a mask fitted over something raw. "Good night, Isolde." He carried Ren into the dark. The kitchen filled with voices, and the moment, whatever it had been about to become, dissolved like breath in winter air. Isolde stands at the work table with flour on her wrists, and the place where his scent touched her skin is still warm. Chapter 7. The warmth faded by dawn. The question did not. She couldn't stop replaying the shape of his mouth before the door slammed. Open. On the edge of something. And then, sealed. The king returning like weather over a landscape that had briefly been bare. She dressed and went to find answers she could control. The castle library occupied 3 rooms on the second floor of the west wing. Not the east. Everything in Valecrest, she was beginning to understand, organized itself around the avoidance of east. She told the librarian she was studying Valecrest's bonding history for the assessment period. True enough. He gave her access without suspicion. She was, after all, here to be evaluated as a potential Luna. Reading about past Lunas was reasonable. The records for Ilara Blackthorn were incomplete. Not missing, incomplete. The distinction mattered. Missing records leave gaps. Incomplete records leave edges. Isolde could see the edges. 3 full years of detailed entries, Ilara's bonding ceremony, her integration into the pack, her public appearances, her health, and then in the final 6 weeks, the entries narrowed to clinical shorthand. Day 31, fatigue. Day 34, appetite loss. Day 38, bond fluctuation. Every entry in the final 6 weeks was in the same hand. The same ink. The same controlled script. Quorums. No other healer had examined the Luna in her final weeks. No second opinion.
No consultation.
The most important patient in the kingdom, the bonded queen of the most powerful Lycan alive, treated by one man, and one man only. She turned the pages. The final entry. Day 42, bond sickness confirmed. Terminal. Recommended, palliative care and sealed chamber to contain residual bond thread decay. Sealed chamber. The iron-studded oak door. She pressed her palm to the page. Paper held less than stone, but the lace site caught fragments, emotional residue from the hand that had written these words. Not the cool precision of medical documentation. Not the steadiness of a healer recording clinical facts. Grief. Guilt. And beneath both, resolve. The terrible, quiet resolve of a man who had already decided what he was going to do and was building the paper trail to justify it afterward. Finding what you need. She closed the ledger. Coram stood at the library entrance with the same warm smile, the same healer's hands, the same patience she now understood was not patience at all. It was surveillance.
The bonding histories are fascinating, she said.
Her voice held. Her heart did not. Your records are very thorough. He crossed the room slowly. His bond thread preceded him, that devotion to something dead, that grief is duty, and as he drew close, she felt something beneath it she had not caught before. Fear. Specific. Directional. Fear of her. The assessment period provides plenty of reading time. His voice was mild. Though perhaps the gardens would serve you better than old medical logs. He knew which records she had been reading. I find the medical logs educational. Silence. 3 seconds. But in those seconds she felt his bond thread tighten, a man running calculations behind kind eyes, weighing her against something only he could see. You should be careful, child. His smile had not changed, but the word careful carried weight that had nothing to do with her well-being. Old records can be misleading without context. She left the library with the entries memorized and the shape of Coram's fear mapped in her chest. In the corridor outside, she nearly walked into Caius. He steadied her, one hand on her arm, brief, practical, and looked past her at the library door, at the direction she'd come from, at the flush on her neck that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with what she'd found. He said nothing. His eyes moved from her face to her neck to the hand he was still holding. He let go. You've changed your dress. She blinked. What? The gray one. Short. Declarative. Offering nothing. You've been wearing it every day. Today it's different. She had put on a dark blue dress this morning because the gray was in the wash. She hadn't thought anyone noticed the gray. She hadn't thought anyone noticed anything about her that wasn't the shape underneath the fabric. He turned and walked away before she could respond. 3 corridors behind her, in a study she cannot see, Elder Coram sits before the council and presents a letter requesting the Ashimir candidate's immediate removal on grounds of medical unsuitability, and every elder in the room listens, because the old healer has never once been wrong about anything. Chapter 8. In 60 years, the old healer had never been wrong about anything. Isolde didn't know this. She was dreaming. The ritual chamber. She had never been inside, but her lay sight had pressed through the oak door often enough that her sleeping mind built the room from feeling. Circular walls, iron brackets, a floor worn smooth by centuries of ceremony. Gold threads everywhere. Alive. Not the static residue she felt in the castle walls by day, but something breathing, a web of light pulsing at a frequency she recognized as not her own. His. He stood at the center. Not as the king. Not in court clothes or crown or the careful architecture of authority. He stood the way fire stands, simply burning, giving warmth whether or not anyone had asked for it. The threads reached for her. Not restraining. Completing. They found the hollow of her throat, the collarbone, the unmarked space, and the moment they touched her skin she felt something she had no name for. Not pain. Not pleasure. Something before both. Something that had been waiting longer than she had been alive. A bite. She woke with her hand pressed to the base of her throat, her fingers covering the hollow as if protecting a wound that didn't exist yet. The second bell hadn't rung when one of the kitchen maids found her in the corridor, still carrying the dream-like heat in her skin. My lady. The girl's bond thread flickered with second-hand anxiety. You should know. The council met last evening regarding your assessment period. Isolde's hands went flat against her thighs. The kitchen reflex. The fear reflex. And the vote was to recommend your return to Ashimir. Medical unsuitability. The maid glanced down the corridor. His Majesty overruled the recommendation. His exact words. The maid swallowed. She stays. That was all he said. Then he left. No one spoke after. 2 words. 7 elders silenced. A candidate he refused to look at in the bonding ceremony, defended in front of the council that rules his kingdom, with less ceremony than ordering a change of candles. She found him in the armory corridor. His back to her. His shirt pulled at the shoulders where he'd been working the training forms, the sweat and iron and animal heat reaching her before his voice could. Were you going to tell me? He turned. His expression gave nothing. The mandate requires 30 days. You have 26 remaining. That's not what I asked. The corridor's bond threads tightened between them. Not the castle's ambient hum. Something newer. Something that started in the narrowing space between her body and his and radiated outward like sound from a struck bell. The council's recommendation was premature, he said. I corrected it. Why? He looked at her the way he had looked at the sealed door, as if the answer was something he would not open. Your bread. The night patrol has been more alert since you arrived. He walked past her. Close enough that his scent grazed her skin and the dream's ghost pressed against the hollow of her throat. She stood in his wake and said nothing because her voice had gone wherever her breath had gone, somewhere he had taken it without meaning to. When the corridor was empty, she pressed her palm to the wall where he had stood and opened her lay sight. His thread ran through the castle like a river through bedrock. She followed it. Past the council chamber. Past the great hall. East. To the sealed door. And there, where the king's bond thread should have connected to the massive grief residue of a dead fated mate, she found something that stole what remained of her breath. The thread was dissolving. Not breaking. Not fraying the way a grieving bond frays, slowly, painfully, clinging. Dissolving. Cleanly. Quietly. As if something in the castle's architecture had recognized that the bond thread it had held for 3 years was anchored to nothing real. 3 years of grief. 3 years of sealed chambers and an empty throne and a king who would not sleep. Built on a bond the castle itself is rejecting, because someone 3 years ago constructed it from nothing. Chapter 9. Someone had built the king's bond. The knowledge sat in Isolde's chest like a coal she couldn't spit out. She went to the kitchen because the kitchen didn't lie. Flour was flour. Heat was heat. Bread rose or it didn't, and no one could construct a false loaf and call it fated. She kneaded, shaped, waited for the small shadow in the doorway, the dragging blanket, the dark eyes too large for a face that hadn't learned to perform yet. Wren didn't come. The child's absence stripped the kitchen bare.
No buffet. No excuse.
No small body to redirect the gravity that filled this room whenever he appeared.
No crown.
No court. The linen shirt, open at the collar, the unmarked hollow of his throat catching firelight as if the flame had been waiting for him. He leaned against the doorframe the way he leaned against everything, as though the structure existed to hold him and not the reverse. No bread for the patrol. It's rising. She kept her eyes on the dough. Patience. He entered. Took his position against the counter, the same spot, the same shoulder pressed to stone. The kitchen was large enough for 20 cooks. He stood 4 feet from her. He always stood 4 feet from her. Your hands, he said. She looked down. Flour to the wrists. A smear across her knuckles where she'd pushed hair from her face. What about them? In the council chamber you press them flat against your thighs. Quiet. Observational. As if reading a text written in a language only he and her body shared. In the kitchen you don't. Her hands stilled on the dough. No one had ever watched her closely enough to notice the difference between her hands in fear and her hands in safety. Not her father. Not the 3 alphas who had evaluated her collarbone in writing. Not a single wolf in Ashenmere who had ever looked at her and seen anything beyond the shape. You watch my hands. He didn't answer. He crossed the distance between the counter and the work table in 2 steps, unhurried, deliberate, as if the closing of that space were an administrative matter, and reached past her for the bread cooling on the stone. His arm crossed the line of her body. His scent hit her like a current, pine, iron, the warm animal depth beneath, and the bond threads in the kitchen walls responded with a hum so low it vibrated in her sternum. She turned her head. He was right there. Closer than 4 feet. Closer than the corridor. Close enough that she could see the gold bleeding into his irises, not reflecting the firelight but generating its own. The wolf. Not aggression. Something older. Something that recognized her the way a river recognizes the sea it has been running toward since it carved its first channel through stone. You have flour. His voice was rough, as if it had to travel through something to reach her. His hand rose. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, slow, deliberate, mapping her by touch because his eyes had already done their work, and then continued downward, along the side of her throat, to the hollow, the collarbone, the unmarked space, the place where the dream had put the bite. His thumb stopped, pressed, held. His breathing changed. Hers had already stopped. The gold in his eyes burned. His mouth opened, the same mouth that had opened in this kitchen once before and been sealed by a slamming door. A howl split the night. Not inside the castle. The perimeter. Sharp, urgent, carrying the unmistakable frequency of a territorial breach. A second howl answered from the watchtower. Then a third. His hand dropped from her throat. His jaw set. The gold cooled to winter gray in the space between one heartbeat and the next, and the man standing in a kitchen with flour dust in the air and his thumb on a woman's pulse became, in a single breath, the most dangerous wolf in 5 kingdoms. Stay here. He was gone. The kitchen settles around her like water closing over a stone, and the place where his thumb pressed is still burning. Chapter 10. The burning faded. The distance did not. Isolde pressed her fingers to the hollow of her throat in the grey light of the guest chamber and felt nothing.
No worms. No residual pulse.
Whatever his thumb had written on her skin, the dawn had erased it. She dressed. The grey wool. The armor. The castle told her what the court would not. The territorial breach had not been an attack. She had felt it through the walls as it happened, a section of the perimeter ward simply stopping, the way a sentence stops when the speaker forgets what they were saying. One moment the ley threads held taut across the northern boundary. The next, silence. A gap. The kingdom's skin had opened and closed again in the space of minutes, but the scar remained. The wards were decaying. Without a completed Luna bond anchoring the territorial lattice, the energy that held Veilcrest's borders had been draining for 3 years, slow enough to ignore, steady enough to kill. She passed him in the western corridor. He was moving fast. 2 guards flanking. The partial shift bled through his edges, his shadow thrown too large against the wall, his jaw heavier, his eyes carrying a gold that did not belong to the morning light. Something inside his body was pressing outward, testing the seams of the shape that held it. Not aggression. Instability. The wolf, destabilizing. 3 years without a bond anchor. The most powerful Lycan in 5 kingdoms, held together by will instead of design. He saw her. Lady Ashenmere. Not Isolde. Not her name. The title. The formal distance he had closed in the kitchen rebuilt in 2 words and the measured stride that carried him past her without slowing. The corridor cooled as he left. She stood in his wake and felt the ley thread settle, sluggish, reluctant, reaching after him the way water reaches after a hand pulled from a stream. Lady Ashenmere. The name her father gave her. The name that meant diplomatic asset. Deployable. Beautiful enough to barter, but never enough to keep. She went to the garden. Not deliberately. The ley sight pulled her, a thread she hadn't noticed before, running through the castle's eastern wall and down a flight of stone stairs to a courtyard she had never entered. Sheltered from wind. Open to sky. Impossibly alive. Flowers. White heliotrope. Nightshade roses. Moonveil, the silver-petaled bloom that appeared in bonding ceremony garlands because it only grew where a fated bond fed the soil. She knew this. Every wolf knew this. Moonveil could not be cultivated. It could not be transplanted. It grew where love lived, and it died when the bond that sustained it ended. These should have died 3 years ago. They were blooming. The old healer knelt among them. His healer's hands, the calluses, the steadiness, the practiced care, moved through the soil with the tenderness of a man visiting a grave. His lips moved. Not prayer. Conversation. The quiet, one-sided murmur of a person speaking to someone who could not answer. She watched from the stairway. He picked a dead leaf from the nightshade with the same precision she had seen in his medical logs, clinical, careful, attending to the smallest detail because the smallest detail was all he had left. His bond thread pulsed in her awareness, the grief devotion she had read in the council chamber, but here in the garden, stripped of performance. Raw. A wound 3 years untended because tending it would mean admitting how it was made. He loved her, Isolde realized. Not the king. Not the kingdom. Ilara. The woman whose flowers he kept alive with. What? Not a fated bond. He was not her mate. Not a pack bond. He was her godfather. Grief. He was feeding the Moonveil with grief so deep it functioned as devotion. The same frequency, the same warmth, close enough to love that the flowers could not tell the difference. The old healer looked up. Saw her on the stairs. For one unguarded second, his face held nothing but the truth. A man who had done a terrible thing to save someone he loved and had spent 3 years keeping flowers alive because it was the only apology the dead would accept. Then the mask returned. The warm smile. The patient eyes. The Moonveil is lovely this season, he said, as if she had not just watched him speak to a dead woman through her garden. Isolde descended the stairs. Knelt in the soil beside him. Touched a silver petal. It was warm. Moonveil only blooms where a fated bond feeds the soil, and it has been 3 years since any fated bond existed within these walls. Chapter 11. The silver petals stayed warm against her fingertips long after she left the garden. Something was feeding the moon veil. Something that felt like a fated bond but wasn't one. Something constructed with enough precision to fool even the flowers. She needed the sealed chamber. But the sealed chamber could wait, because Elder Coram was standing in the doorway of her guest room when she returned, and the warm smile was gone. "Sit down, child." Not a request. She sat on the edge of the bed. He closed the door. He looked older without the mask. The healer's composure stripped back to reveal the architecture beneath, exhaustion, calculation, and something she recognized with a jolt of lay sight so sharp it hurt. Terror. You see them. Not a question. The threads. The bonds in the stone. You've seen them since you arrived. Her hands went flat against her thighs. The lay sight. He said the words the way a physician names a terminal diagnosis. Precise, quiet, final. You've hidden it well. But not well enough. I've been watching for it since the moment you entered the Great Hall. How did you? Because Elara had it. The room changed temperature. Not the castle's ambient hum. Her own blood, running cold. Elara carried the lay sight from birth. She hid it, as you have hidden it. As every woman in your bloodline has hidden it since the purges, because the last wolf who revealed it openly was burned as a heretic. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. I know the history. Then you know what happens when the lay sight wakes fully inside a lunabond. He sat in the chair opposite her. His hands, the healer's hands, the hands that had held Elara as an infant, folded in his lap with a stillness that cost him visibly. The gift feeds on the bond. It amplifies. It reaches through the territorial lattice and touches every thread in the kingdom. And if the bond cannot contain the gift's expansion, it consumes the king's wolf. It consumed him. Coram's voice cracked. A single fracture in 60 years of composure, and through it she saw everything: the ritual chamber, the gold thread on the floor, the woman growing cold in his arms. I watched it begin. The bond was pulling his wolf apart. Another month, and there would have been nothing left of him. Not the man. Not the king. Not the wolf. Nothing. Silence. The castle hummed. You killed her. He did not flinch. I severed the bond. The severance was fatal. I knew it would be. The words hung between them, clinical, precise, carrying the weight of a confession 3 years overdue. She waited for the horror to arrive. It didn't. What arrived instead was worse. Understanding. She understood him. The old man who had held his goddaughter as a newborn and held her again as she died. Who had made the calculation no healer should ever have to make, the patient or the king, and chosen with hands steady enough to perform a severance rite so clean it fooled every wolf in the kingdom. You loved her. More than anything in this world. Simple. Absolute. The most honest sentence she had heard inside these walls. And I will do it again before I watch another lay-gifted woman destroy him. The threat landed soft. That was what made it devastating. Not anger, not malice, but the quiet certainty of a man who had already proven he would do the worst thing imaginable for the best reason he knew. Leave Veilcrest, Isolde. Her name in his mouth for the first time. Take your gift and go home. The council will approve your departure. The king will recover. And I will not have to. His voice stopped. His hands unfolded. Refold. Please. The most powerful word he could have used. Not a command. Not a warning. A prayer, offered by a man who had run out of better options. She looked at him, the healer, the murderer, the godfather, the gardener, and felt the terrible weight of a man who was not wrong about the danger and not right about the solution. What if the bond was the problem? She said. His face went still.
What if the reason the lay sight consumed the king's wolf wasn't the gift, but the bond it was feeding on? What if the bond couldn't contain it because the bond was never
Stop.
Never real.
The temperature in the room dropped. Not metaphor. The ley threads in the walls contracted, a reflexive flinch, as if the castle itself recoiled from the words. Coram stood. His chair scraped stone. His composure reassembled, piece by piece, like a man rebuilding a wall he has lived behind for so long he no longer remembers the landscape on the other side. You don't know what you're saying.
I know what the walls say. I know what the sealed chamber holds. And I know. She stood too. Her hands left her thighs. I know that Moonvale only blooms where a faded bond feeds the soil, and you have been feeding those flowers with something that isn't a faded bond and never was.
His eyes, the kind eyes, the patient eyes, the eyes that had watched her since the great hall with a terror she now understood completely, closed. 23 days remain in your assessment. His voice was the healer's voice again. Controlled. Clinical. Final. I suggest you use them to pack. He left. She stood in the guest room with her heart slamming against her ribs and the lacite screaming. Not the walls, not the castle, but every thread in her body pulling east, pulling toward the sealed door, pulling toward the truth that Coram had spent 3 years burying behind iron and oak. She went. Not carefully. Not quietly. Down the corridor, past the library, through the turn where the torches stopped and the dust began. The iron-studded oak door. She pressed both palms flat and drove her lay sight through the wood with everything she had, not reading the surface this time but reaching through it, past the severance residue, past the constructed grief, down to the oldest layer. The foundation. And there, beneath the cut bond, beneath the careful architecture of a fated connection that had fooled a king and a kingdom, she found the maker's signature. The hands that had woven the bond in the first place. The same calluses. The same precision. The same healer's touch that had tended Moonvale in a garden and poured a sleep tonic in her doorway. Coram hadn't just killed the bond. Coram had built it. The bond between Caius and Alara, the great love of the king's life, the grief that had hollowed him for 3 years, the fated connection he believed the moon herself had ordained, had been constructed by a 60-year-old healer with the skill to forge what nature had not provided and the love to believe it was mercy. Every wall, every thread, every stone in this castle recalibrated in her awareness. 3 years of mourning for a bond that was never fated, anchored to a love that was never real, sealed behind a door by the man who had created the lie and then killed it when it became too dangerous to sustain. Her palms burned against the oak. Behind her, boots on stone. The king of Vale Crests reached her before his voice did. I told you not to come back here. She turned. He stood at the end of the corridor, the partial shift pressing at his edges, his eyes gold with the wolf that recognized her even when the man would not. She should have lied. She should have said she was lost, or curious, or sleepwalking. She should have protected him the way Coram had protected him, with silence and sealed doors and the comfortable architecture of grief. She opened her mouth. In the garden below, Elder Coram pulls the iron key from his belt and walks toward the east corridor with the unhurried pace of a man who has made this decision before, and behind him, 2 members of the council carry the implements required to cleanse a ritual chamber of every bond trace it has ever held. Chapter 12. He had made this decision before. So had she. The difference was that his decisions killed people, and hers merely killed whatever she had left to hope for. She turned from the sealed door to face him and chose the truth the way a surgeon chooses the blade, not because she wanted to cut, but because the wound was already open and pretending otherwise would only deepen it. Alara's bond was constructed. He went still. Not the stillness of a man listening. The stillness of a building before the earthquake reaches it.
Coram built it. The bond between you and your Luna was forged, assembled by a healer's hands to stabilize the kingdom after your father died. It was not fated. It was not the moon's design. It was craft. And when the lacite Alara carried began feeding on a bond that had no real foundation, the gift turned destructive, because the structure couldn't hold it. So Coram severed what he built. And your Luna died.
She watched the words land. Each one hit a different part of him. She could see it in his bond threads, which she hadn't meant to read but couldn't stop reading, because the Laysite was awake and his pain was the loudest thing in the corridor. Grief. Disbelief. The terrible structural shudder of a man whose foundation has just been told it does not exist. You don't. His jaw worked. The gold bled into his irises. His wolf pressing forward, not to attack, to listen. You can't know that. I felt the Maker's signature through the door. The same hands. The same calluses. The same precision he uses in the garden when he tends her moon veil. Stop. The same hands that poured me a sleep tonic with something bitter I couldn't name. I said stop. The word cracked the corridor. The bond threads in the walls contracted. His authority, his power, the force that held an entire kingdom together through will rather than design, pressing outward like a shockwave. She felt it against her skin and held her ground. You have been here, he said, and his voice was different now, lower, slower, the king reassembling over the man the way a drawbridge closes over water, for 12 days. You have been in my castle for 12 days, and you are telling me that 60 years of service, that the man who held my father's hand when he died, who stood beside me at the bonding altar, who sat with me through every night of the first year when I could not. His syntax broke. I don't know what I have never. And then the drawbridge finished closing, and the man disappeared behind the king, and what came out of his mouth was the thing she had been afraid of since her first altar. Your father trained you to fill thrones, Isolde. Cold. Measured. Each word a stone placed with a mason's precision. You are a beautiful woman with a convenient gift, telling a grieving king that his love was a lie, so the throne has room for you. Not shouting. Worse than shouting. The quiet certainty of a man who had decided what she was and sealed the decision the way he sealed doors, with iron and silence and the absolute refusal to look at what was behind them. She waited for the denial to rise. The argument. The competence that should have met his cruelty with evidence and logic, and the stubborn insistence that she was more than what he saw. It didn't come. Because he had found the one wound no evidence could close, and pressed. She was a beautiful woman. She had always been a beautiful woman. And every altar she had ever stood at had taught her the same lesson. Beauty is what they send you for, and beauty is why they send you back. She pressed her hands flat against her thighs. I will leave in the morning. He said nothing. His jaw held. His eyes, gold and gray at war, gave nothing. She walked away. He did not follow. At the end of the east corridor, where the torchlight from the main hall broke across the flagstones, the walls began to hum. Not the screaming frequency she had felt on her first night, not the ambient warmth of pack bonds, not the sharp cold of severance. Something new. A vibration she has never felt in any building, any stone, any pack she has ever entered. It sounds like her name. Chapter 13. The walls hummed her name through the night, and she packed anyway. The gray wool dress. The trunk she had arrived with. She left the ivory bonding gown hanging in the wardrobe. It had never been hers, and leaving it was the first honest decision she had made since walking into the great hall. Dawn came thin and colorless. Coram knocked. He carried the clay cup. Ashwood and valerian. And beneath them, the same bitter undertone she had smelled the first time and never identified. For the journey, he said. The road to Ashenmere is hard on the body. She took the cup. Held it. The tonic sat in her palms like a question with only one right answer and two people in the room who disagreed about which one it was. What is the third ingredient? A pause. Not deception, calculation. How much truth would keep her compliant? Blackthorn extract. It dampens the lay sight. Temporarily. The healer's voice. Clinical. Kind. Entirely in control. An unanchored lay gift on the open road is a danger to you and anyone near you. The blackthorn will suppress the sensitivity until you reach Ashenmere. True. She could feel the truth threaded through his bond, the healer's genuine concern for her safety layered over 60 years of something harder. He wanted her gift silenced. The medical justification was real enough to carry the rest. She raised the cup. Don't. Wren. In the doorway. Blanket trailing. dark eyes fixed on the cup with the unfiltered certainty of a creature too young to lie about what her senses told her. That smells wrong. A child's verdict.
No diplomacy.
No performance. 4 years old and entirely correct. Isolde set the cup on the windowsill. Her fingers released the clay rim, and she felt, beneath the resignation, beneath the packed trunk and the bonding gown left behind, something she had not felt since walking away from Caius in the East Corridor. Anger. Not at the king. Not at Coram. At herself. For packing. For leaving. For doing exactly what every wolf in her life had ever told her to do. Be beautiful, be quiet, be somewhere else. Are you leaving? Wren asked. The ground shuddered. Not the surface tremor of the perimeter breach 3 nights ago. This was structural. The territorial wards didn't open, they fell. An entire section of the northern lattice collapsed in Isolde's awareness, and the silence spread through the castle's bond architecture like frost across glass. Fast. Brittle. Irreversible. The silence reached Wren. The child screamed, not fear but pain, a wolf pup's body caught in the path of a collapsing ward lattice without the shielding that an adult wolf's bond provided. Wren crumpled. Her small frame seized on the stone floor, the blanket tangling around her legs, her breath coming in sharp, animal bursts. Isolde dropped. Not thinking. Not calculating. Not performing the beauty or the diplomacy or the carefully hidden gift she had spent her whole life pressing against her thighs. She gathered the child into her arms and reached down, not into the walls, not into the surface down. Into the lattice. Into the web of territorial bonds that held Veilcrest together and were now unraveling thread by thread because the king's bond anchor had been hollow for 3 years and there was nothing left to hold. The lay sight opened. Light spilled from her palms, not metaphor, not sensation, but visible golden threads pouring from her hands and wrapping around Wren's body like a cocoon. She didn't read the bonds this time. She wove them. Her fingers found the severed ends of the collapsed ward section and knit them back together with a precision she had never been taught and had always possessed. The architecture of connection, the grammar of belonging, the thing that had hummed beneath her skin since childhood and had never once been permitted to speak. The ward held. Wren's breathing steadied. Her eyes closed. Sleep, not unconsciousness. The golden thread settled into the stone like embroidery stitched into ancient fabric, permanent, structural, part of the castle now. Isolde looked up. Caius stood in the corridor outside her door. The partial shift had broken through entirely, his shadow enormous against the wall, his eyes gold without a trace of gray, his wolf no longer pressing against the man but aligned with him for the first time since she had arrived. Both halves looking at her. Both halves recognizing what they saw. Not her body. Not her beauty. Not the collarbone or the throat or the shape that 3 packs had described in letters. Her hands. Behind him, at the corridor's turn, half hidden by the angle of the wall, Elder Coram stood motionless. His healer's hands hung at his sides. His face held the expression of a man watching the foundation beneath his feet dissolve. The lay gift, channeled through a bond the castle itself had been humming her name to complete, had not consumed. Had not destroyed. Had not torn the king's wolf apart the way it had torn at the constructed bond 3 years ago. It had healed. Coram's hands, the hands that had built a bond, severed a bond, held a dying goddaughter, tended her flowers for 3 years, and mixed blackthorn into a clay cup on a windowsill, begin to shake. Chapter 14. Coram's hands were still shaking when the king took the iron key from his belt. She did not see him take it. She heard it, the click of iron leaving leather, the weight of it in a fist that could bend steel, the footsteps that crossed the east corridor and stopped in front of the door he had told her never to approach. The door he had sealed for 3 years. The door he now opened. The oak groaned. The iron hinges wept rust. Air moved, stale sealed, carrying the scent of spent ritual and old stone and something beneath both that smelled like grief pressed into mineral. He stepped back. He did not enter first. Show me. 2 words. Not a command. Not a king's order. A man asking a woman to destroy the only thing he had left of the person he had loved most, because she had already proven she would tell him the truth when everyone else had built him a comfortable lie. Isolde entered. The chamber was circular. Iron brackets on the walls. The floor worn smooth by centuries of ceremony. Her lay sight opened before she asked it to. The room demanded it, the way a wound demands air. And there, everywhere, the evidence. Bond threads. Hundreds of them. Layered into the stone like veins in marble. She could read the architecture the way a mason reads a wall. Here, the foundation stones. Here, the keystones. Here, the load-bearing threads that held the entire structure together. And every single one of them bore the same signature, the same healer's calluses, the same careful precision, the same loving craftsmanship. Built. Every thread. Built by hand. Not just the bond between the king and his Luna. The web that connected that bond to the territorial wards. The lattice that fed the kingdom's borders. The entire architecture of Veilcrest's protection, constructed around a core that was never real. She turned to tell him. He already knew. The gold had consumed his eyes entirely. Not the wolf pressing forward, the wolf arriving. The part of him that had howled at the bonding ceremony, that had tracked her scent through corridors, that had pressed his thumb to her throat in a kitchen at midnight. The part that had always known. A sound left him. Not a word. Not a growl. Something between. The sound a man makes when the grief he has carried for 3 years is lifted and what remains underneath is not relief but the staggering emptiness of a foundation that was never there. He looked at her. The wolf looked at her. For the first time, there was no war between them. And in the center of the chamber, visible only to her, a single thread. Gold. Alive. Unbuilt. Unforged. Running from the hollow of his throat to the hollow of hers in a line so clean and so ancient it predated the chamber, the castle, the kingdom itself. The true bond. It has always been here. Chapter 15. It has always been here, and no one saw it, because someone had built a palace on top of it and called the architecture fate. Tell me everything. Not the king's voice. Not the wolf's. Something stripped past both. A man standing in the wreckage of the only truth he had and asking for the one that would replace it. Coram told him. The old healer stood in the doorway of the ritual chamber with his hands at his sides and his mask on the floor and 60 years of service distilled into sentences that fell like stones. Your father died without warning. The kingdom was fracturing. You were 23 years old and your wolf was destabilizing without a bond anchor. The council decided you needed a Luna. Not in months. Not in years. Immediately. His voice held. His eyes did not. There was no fated mate. We searched. The moon had not provided. So a breath. A fracture. I built one. I knew Alara's bond signature better than anyone alive. She was my goddaughter. I had held her the day she was born. I knew every thread of her. You chose her because you loved her. I chose her because I loved you both. And I believed the craft would hold. That a bond built with enough precision, enough care, enough love from the builder, would become real. Silence. The castle waited. It didn't hold, Isolde said. No. The word cost him everything it had left to cost. The lay sight Alara carried began feeding on the bond. In a true fated bond, the gift expands and heals. It channels through the connection and strengthens the territorial lattice. But in a constructed bond, there is no root system. No foundation. The gift had nothing real to feed on. It turned inward. It began consuming the king's wolf. The shared clue. The single piece of information that answered every question simultaneously. Why Alara died. The constructed bond could not contain her gift. Why Isolde's gift healed the wards instead of destroying them? Because the bond pulling her toward Caius was not constructed. Not assembled. Not built by any healer's hands. Real. Fated. The foundation Coram had spent 60 years searching for and never found, because it hadn't arrived yet. Caius looked at Isolde. She felt his gaze the way she felt ley threads, as pressure, as temperature, as a physical force that rearranged the air between them. And in his eyes she saw the thing she had been afraid to find since her first altar. Recognition. Complete. Unbuilt. His. Not her body. Not her beauty. Not the collarbone that 3 packs had described in correspondence. Her. "I called you a convenient gift," he said. His voice was quiet. Wrecked. "I said you were telling a grieving king his love was a lie so the throne had room for you." She said nothing. She waited. "I was describing myself." Each word placed like a man walking on glass. A convenient grief. A comfortable lie. A sealed room I refused to open because opening it meant admitting that everything I built on Alara's memory, every night I didn't sleep, every ceremony I refused, every woman I turned away, was built on something that was never. His syntax broke. The ground broke with it. Not a tremor this time. The northern wards didn't collapse, they detonated. The lattice Isolde had repaired in Ren's arms tore open along every seam she had stitched, and the cascade spread south, east, west, the entire territorial web unraveling as the castle's bond architecture finally rejected the hollow core it had been holding for 3 years. Caius dropped. One knee. Then both. The partial shift ripped through him, not controlled, not the careful bleeding through she had seen in corridors. This was structural. The wolf and the man tearing apart along the same fault line the wards were tearing along, because the king's bond anchor was the kingdom's bond anchor and both were built on nothing. His hands hit the stone. His spine arched. A sound tore out of him that was neither human nor wolf, the sound of a body trying to hold 2 halves together when the architecture between them has finally, irrevocably, failed. Isolde. Her name. Not a command. Not a title. A man saying the name of the woman whose bond thread ran to his throat in a line of living gold. Asking, not ordering, not demanding, not the king, not the wolf, the man, asking. She looked at Coram. The old healer stood in the doorway with tears on a face that had not wept in 3 years. "It won't destroy him?" she asked. "No." His voice broke on the word. "It never would have. I was wrong. I was always wrong." She looked at the king on the stone floor. The wolf in his eyes. The gold thread running between them. The kingdom falling apart around a man who had been held together by a lie and was now being offered, for the first time in his life, something true. She could leave. She could walk through the doorway, past the weeping healer, down the east corridor, and take her gift and her gray wool dress back to Ashimere, where her father would find another altar and another court and another king who would evaluate her collarbone in writing. She could be beautiful somewhere else. She could be wanted for the wrong reasons in a place that didn't hum her name. Isolde steps forward. Chapter 16. She stepped forward. Not the way she had stepped onto the first altar, arranged, positioned, her body angled for maximum display. Not the way she had stepped onto the second or the third. Not the way she had entered this castle 12 days ago in a gown selected for how it showed her throat. She stepped forward the way a river steps into the sea. Because it has arrived. Because the journey was always leading here. Because the forward motion was never a decision, it was a destination. Caius was on his knees. The wolf tearing through him. His hands clawed against stone that cracked beneath his fingers. The bond architecture of the kingdom unraveling through his body. Every thread, every ward, every lie the castle had held for 3 years pulling apart at the seams, and the sound he made was not language. It was the sound of a man being emptied. She knelt. His scent hit her, not the controlled notes she had catalogued in kitchens and corridors. The raw animal core beneath. Blood and pine and the deep mineral heat of a wolf at the edge of losing its form entirely. His body radiated it. The partial shift had gone past partial, his jaw extended, his shoulders too broad, his spine curving into a shape that belonged to neither man nor wolf but to the terrible space between. She reached for him. "Don't," his voice shredded. "The wolf in it now. If you touch me I cannot. I don't know what I'll." "Ido." She placed her hands on either side of his face. The shock traveled through her palms and up her arms and met the lace sight at the center of her chest, and the collision produced a light she felt before she saw, gold, ancient, rising from the place where her skin met his like dawn breaking beneath the surface of a lake. The true bond illuminated. She could see it now without reaching. The gold thread running from his throat to hers. Not a single filament but a lattice, a root system, a living architecture that had been waiting beneath the castle's false foundations since before either of them was born. It had waited through his father's death. Through the forged bond. Through Ilara. Through 3 years of sealed chambers and empty thrones. Through 12 days of corridors and bread and a thumb pressed to an unmarked collarbone. It had waited. She was done waiting. Her hands slid from his face to his shoulders. Down. To the collar of his shirt. She pulled the fabric aside, the motion deliberate, unhurried, the first time she had ever undressed anyone for a reason that belonged entirely to her, and the hollow of his throat lay bare. The unmarked space. The place where every Luna leaves her claim. She looked at him. His eyes were gold. The wolf and the man. No war between them. No wall. Both halves present, both halves watching her with an expression she had spent her entire life being told she would never see, not desire, not evaluation, not the careful appraisal of a body being weighed for diplomatic value. Oh. She leaned in. Her lips found his throat first, the pulse point, hammering, alive, and she breathed him in one final time. Pine. Iron. The animal warmth that had tracked her through corridors and watched her knead bread at midnight and held a sleeping child against its ribs because a 4-year-old asked. She bit. Her teeth broke skin. His blood touched her tongue and the taste was not copper, it was lightning. The lay sight detonated. Gold poured from her body into his, from his into the walls, from the walls into the foundation stones of the kingdom. The bond thread that had waited for centuries to be completed ignited along its full length, root to branch, foundation to sky, and the territorial lattice of Vale Crest rebuilt itself in a single breath. Not the fragile architecture Coram had constructed. Not the calculated web of a healer who loved enough to forge what nature hadn't provided. Something older. Something with roots so deep they reached past the castle's foundation into the bedrock beneath. The wards knit together.
Trek by trek.
Ward by ward. The lattice closing like a flower made of light, north, south, east, west, each section locking into place with an audible resonance that vibrated through the floor, through the walls, through every stone in the castle. Light poured from every window of Vale Crest. Not candlelight. Not moonlight. Something golden and structural, as if the castle itself was exhaling for the first time in 3 years, and the breath was made of the bond that had finally been allowed to exist. In the courtyard below, wolves looked up. In the barracks, the night patrol stopped mid-stride. In the garden, the moon veil blazed, not the quiet silver of grief-sustained blooms but a gold so bright it turned the petals translucent. Caius's body stilled beneath her. The partial shift receded. The wolf and the man, no longer at war. His breathing steadied, slow, deep, the breathing of a man whose foundation has been replaced beneath him while he knelt on it. His hands, the hands that had torn stone, rose from the floor and found her waist. He held her the way he had held Ren. As if she weighed nothing. As if the force his body could produce was infinite and every ounce of it existed to be withheld. Isolde. Her name. In his voice. With his blood on her mouth and his bond in her chest and the kingdom shining through every window around them. Not the way a king says a name. The way a man says the name of the thing he thought he'd lost before he ever found it. She has not been chosen for her body. She has not been bartered or displayed or shipped across a kingdom to fill an empty throne. She has chosen, and the kingdom is still ringing with the sound of it. Chapter 17. The ringing lasted until dawn. Isolde felt it in every surface she touched, the walls, the stone floors, the wooden door frame of the ritual chamber where she leaned while the first gray light crept through windows that still carried traces of gold. The bond hummed through the castle like a second heartbeat, steady and structural, and the lay threads that had screamed through the east corridor for 3 years now pulsed with a warmth she recognized. Her own. Caius sat on the chamber floor with his back against the wall. The claiming mark on his throat was visible, her teeth, her shape, permanent. He touched it once. His fingers traced the edge with the careful attention of a man learning to read a language written on his own skin. He didn't smile. But the thing his face did, the unlocking, the slow dismantling of a structure that had held for 3 years, was worth more than a smile. It was the architectural equivalent of opening every sealed door in the castle simultaneously. Footsteps in the corridor. Coram appeared in the doorway. He looked at the chamber, at the gold residue on the walls, at the claiming mark on the king's throat, at Isolde. His healer's hands hung at his sides. They had stopped shaking. What replaced the tremor was worse, a stillness so complete it looked like surrender. "The wards are holding," he said. The clinical voice. The last mask he owned. Yes. Caius's voice was quiet. Not cold. Not the king's voice. "Because she is what you spent 60 years looking for. And you almost killed her for it." The words landed. Coram absorbed them the way stone absorbs rain, silently, completely, without visible change on the surface. But Isolde saw what lived beneath. The bond thread that ran from the old healer to the absent space where Alara had been, the grief devotion that had sustained Moonvale for 3 years, shifted. Not breaking. Transforming. The thread that had been anchored to guilt began, slowly, to reattach itself to something present. Something alive. "I killed my goddaughter to save you," Coram said. "And the saving was built on a mistake I made when I was young enough to believe that love could be constructed." Silence. "I am not asking forgiveness. I am telling you what I owe and offering you the rest of my life to collect it." Caius looked at Isolde. Not for permission. For something harder, the perspective of the woman whose gift had answered the question Coram's hands had asked for 60 years. "He was wrong about the bond," she said. Carefully. Because the next words would determine whether a murderer and a king could exist in the same kingdom. He was not wrong about the love. Coram's composure broke. Not dramatically. Not the shattering she had seen in Caius when the truth arrived. A quieter fracture, the kind that happens when a man who has held himself together with certainty discovers that the woman he nearly destroyed has offered him the one thing he did not expect. Understanding. She crossed the chamber. Took his hands, the healer's hands, the calloused hands, the hands that had built and severed and tended and poisoned and shaken and stilled. She held them the way she held bread dough. Firmly. With the knowledge that something worth making required pressure. "Teach me," she said. He blinked. Tears on a face that had not wept since the night before. The lay sight. The bond architecture. 60 years of knowledge about the threads that hold wolves together. She squeezed his hands. The hands that had committed the worst act in Valecrest's history, because they understood the bonds better than anyone alive. "You built something that shouldn't have been possible. You sustained it for years. You kept Moonvale alive with grief alone. That knowledge doesn't die with your guilt. It lives, if you teach it." The old healer looked at the young queen with her gray wool dress and her flower-calloused fingers, and the light of a completed bond running through her like current through copper. He looked at the king on the floor with his goddaughter's replacement holding his hands and offering him a purpose that was not punishment. He looked at the gold threads in the walls, real, alive, rooted so deep they would outlast the stone itself. His hands closed around hers. "Then we start," he said, "with the foundation." Later, hours or minutes, she could not tell, Isolde walked the corridor alone. The castle's hum had settled into a frequency she could finally name. Home. Not the home she had been shipped from. Not the home she had been shipped to. The home she had made, with her teeth, with her gift, with the choice no one had made for her. She passed the kitchen. Stopped. Inside, on the hearthstone, Wren sat cross-legged with a piece of bread in one hand and the king's wolf lying beside her. Not the partial shift, not the restrained bleed-through of a man holding his animal in check. The full wolf. Enormous. Silver-dark. Its head resting on its paws while a 4-year-old child leaned against its flank and ate bread in the quiet certainty that the most dangerous creature in 5 kingdoms would not move until she was finished. Caius's wolf eye opened. Found Isolde in the doorway. Gold. Steady. Warm. Not a howl. A hum. The kitchen smells of bread and pine and something that might, if she is not careful, become the rest of her life. Epilogue. 6 months later. The Queen Solar smelled of warm stone and ink and the faint ozone tang of lay threads held between living fingers. Isolde sat cross-legged on the floor, not the chair, never the chair, with her hands open and golden light strung between them like embroidery pulled taut on a frame. 3 young she-wolves sat around her in a half-circle, their eyes wide, their own fingers raised and trembling as they reached for threads they were only beginning to feel. Here. She guided the nearest girl's hand, 12 years old, terrified, gifted. Found in the northern settlement during the first territorial survey Isolde had ordered as Luna. The girl's lace sight had been hidden since birth. Her mother had bound her hands at night to keep her from reaching for the walls in her sleep. Don't push. Listen. The thread will tell you where it wants to go. The girl's fingers found the bond thread running through the solar wall. Her face changed, not understanding, not yet, but the first recognition that what lived inside her was not a curse. It was a language. And someone was finally teaching her to speak it. On the desk behind them, dark oak scarred, the same desk that had held 300 years of Luna correspondence, 2 documents sat side by side. The first, the old bonding law, ink-faded, language precise, detailing the terms under which a daughter of any allied pact could be assessed, bartered, and delivered to a king's altar for evaluation. The second, its replacement. Isolde's handwriting. Isolde's law. No wolf in Veilcrest shall be offered in bond without her own voice spoken freely at the altar. No body shall serve as currency. No beauty shall be weighed as worth. 17 pacts had ratified it. 3 had refused. Those 3 would come around, not because the Luna was beautiful though she was, but because the territorial wards anchored by her bond had made Veilcrest the most stable kingdom in 5 generations, and stability, in the end, spoke louder than tradition. Below the solar window, in the courtyard garden, Elder Coram knelt among the moonveil. The flowers had changed since the claiming, no longer silver, no longer sustained by grief, but shot through with gold veins that caught the light like threads woven into petals. He tended them still. Every morning. His hands steady now. Not the steadiness of a man who had trained his tremor into submission, but the steadiness of a man whose hands had been given something to build that was worth building. He was teaching the youngest she-wolf how to read bond signatures in soil. His voice carried through the open window, patient, precise, gentle, and Isolde paused her lesson to listen, the way she always paused, because the sound of a murderer becoming a teacher was not something she would ever take for granted. In the far corner of the solar, Wren sat on a cushion with a book she was pretending to read and a piece of bread she was not pretending to eat. 5 years old now. Still dragging the blanket. Still appearing in kitchens at midnight, though now the kitchens were never empty. There was always bread cooling, always a fire banked, always someone awake. Isolde had made sure of that. No child in Veilcrest would wander dark corridors alone again. Not while her lay threads ran through the walls. Footsteps in the corridor. The bond thread shifted, that familiar displacement, that gravitational pull, the hum in every surface announcing him before his shadow reached the door. Caius leaned in the doorway. Arms crossed. The claiming mark visible at his open collar, her teeth, her shape, permanent as the wards it had rebuilt. He watched her on the floor with golden light between her fingers and 3 young wolves learning to speak a language that had almost died with them, and his face held the expression the court had started calling the king's only weakness. They were wrong about that, too. It was not weakness. It was the face of a man who had spent 3 years mourning a bond that never existed and had been given, by a woman in a gray wool dress who baked bread at 3 in the morning, the thing no healer could construct and no curse could forge. The real thing. Their eyes met. His wolf, the wolf that had howled at a bonding ceremony, tracked her scent through corridors, lain beside a sleeping child on a kitchen hearthstone, stirred behind his gaze. It doesn't howl. It hums. If this story got you, there are more where it came from. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and drop a comment below telling me which moment hit hardest. And if you want to dive into more stories like this one right now, I've left a free trial to Audible in the description. It's the best place to find more stories like this, and the first one is on me.